Thus far in our series on the life of Moses, we've noted the faith of his parents and the Hebrew midwives. We've talked about his struggle with who he is and what his purpose was. We looked at his call to return back to Egypt at the age of 80 and him attempting to exempt himself from that call. And we've talked about the increased oppression that was brought upon the Israelites because when he went back, he went into Pharaoh and he said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh didn't like that. And so he increased the oppression upon the people. We ended our last study close to the end of chapter 6, and so we're going to pick up at the end of chapter 6 today. And what we see in verse 29 is the Lord reaffirming Moses' mission. You're here to go speak to Pharaoh. And so the Lord spoke to Moses, said, "I am the Lord, speak to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you." Moses, that's why I brought you here. Go talk to Pharaoh on my account. And at verse 30, notice Moses' reply said before the Lord, "Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips, and how shall Pharaoh heed me?" Remember, his people won't listen to him. Right now, they don't like him very much. They're going through greater oppression because Moses went to Pharaoh. And so Moses is still not on board with the mission. Yes, he's in Egypt, where he's supposed to be. Yes, he's gone into Pharaoh, where he was supposed to go. But things aren't going the way that he would have expected it to go. And so he still doubts that God can use him to free the Hebrew people. That will change today. And as we go forward into our lesson, looking at the 10 plagues of Egypt. In chapter 7 and verse 1, listen to what God says back to Moses. "See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother shall be your prophet." Pharaoh has rejected the Lord. Remember his statement back in chapter 4. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" I don't know who the Lord is, not going to listen to him. In his mind, the Hebrew God was an inferior God. Now, Egypt has all kinds of gods, and Egypt is the great world power at this time. And so there's a God of slaves. Why should I listen to a God of slaves? In fact, Pharaoh counts himself to be the greatest of the gods. And so why would he stoop himself to that? God tells Moses, you're going to be like a god before Pharaoh. Pharaoh is going to fear when he sees you coming into his presence. And that's going to take place in just a bit. Here in the early part of chapter 7, God gives Moses a quick rundown of here's what's going to happen. Verse 3, "I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart." Now, there's a lot of discussion about, well, Pharaoh hardened his heart, God hardened his heart. Who hardened his heart? God gave Pharaoh a command that Pharaoh did not want to obey. And so both of them were involved in the hardening of his heart. A parent tells a child, "Go clean your room," and the child doesn't want to go clean the room. Who hardened the child's heart? Well, the child doesn't like the command, and so they've hardened their heart against it. The parent gave the command. Well, was it wrong for the parent to give the command? No, it wasn't. But if the parent hadn't given the command, then the child wouldn't have had the response they did. God commanded Pharaoh what he was supposed to do, and he refused to do it. And so God hardened his heart by the command that he gave. Pharaoh hardened his heart by the response that he gave. So go in and talk to Pharaoh, but I'm going to harden his heart. He doesn't want to let the people go. And that will be the occasion then for multiple signs to be brought against Egypt. And that would be the plagues. Verse 4, Pharaoh is still going to refuse to hear. And so even after a couple of plagues come along, Pharaoh's still going to have a hard heart. And then God says, "I will lay my hand against Egypt with a great judgment." Verse 5, "The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And the end result is that it will be, the gods of Egypt will be exposed as being false and inferior rather than the God of the Hebrews. As we move on through the text, and God tells Moses, when you come into the sight of Pharaoh and he asks you for a miracle, here's what you're going to do. And so we don't have the conversation which led up to it, but Pharaoh did ask Moses and Aaron to show a miracle. Verse 9. And so what Aaron did was he cast his rod down to the ground and it turned into a serpent. Verse 10. Pharaoh calls for his magicians. And his magicians, through their enchantments, are able to do the exact same thing. They've got their rods and they cast them down and they become serpents as well. And so Pharaoh's not really that impressed, but Aaron's rod swallows up the other rods. And then he takes up his rod. He's the only one with a rod now. The magicians don't have a rod anymore. And the end result of that, when Pharaoh sees that, yes, his magicians can do the same thing that Aaron was doing, but Aaron did it greater, and so Pharaoh's heart grew hard. He was not willing to acknowledge the power that was displayed before him. He believed, well, my gods and my magicians can do the same kind of thing. Big deal. Why would I submit to this god of slaves? And so in verse 15, we're told that the plagues will begin the next day. The plagues will start on the next day. Now, I'm sure that you're familiar with the 10 plagues of Egypt. It's one of those stories that we hear from the time that we're just young children in Bible classes. But did you know that the plagues of Egypt, each and every one of them, is a blow against the gods and goddesses of Egypt? All 10 of them deal with their gods. And that's the issue here. Why won't Pharaoh let them go? It's not just that they're a bunch of slaves that I want to keep. This is about spiritual things. This is about Pharaoh. I don't know who the Lord is. I don't know who Yahweh is. Why would I submit to Yahweh when I'm the greatest of all the gods? And Egypt, the greatest nation, has a myriad of gods. What have we need for this God? And so it deals with the spiritual battle. And refusing to acknowledge the one true God, he gave glory to all these false gods. God is going to lash out at these false gods through the plagues. And so the plagues would then teach Egypt and teach all the world who the one true God is. And in the process, he would also demonstrate the futility of trusting in anything or anyone but him. Egypt had more than 10 gods and goddesses. There's only 10 plagues. You ever thought about why just 10 plagues? I went to a couple of sources online to find out how many gods and goddesses did ancient Egypt have. Wikipedia, maybe not the greatest resource, but it has some information. They list 53 ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses. Another site that I was perusing suggested that there were over 2,000 gods and goddesses in ancient Egypt. Basically a god for everything and everyone. And so why just 10 plagues? God could have brought 2,000 plus plagues on them if he had chosen to do so, I suppose. But he chooses to bring just 10 plagues. There are some numbers in the Bible that tend to appear over and over. And let me caution you, we need to be careful not to look for hidden codes or hidden meanings and things like that. And yet at the same time, we need to acknowledge the recurrence of numbers and how God uses those numbers. The number 3 and the number 7, the number 12, the number 40. We're going to see those appear over and over again in different scenarios. The number 10 is also one of those numbers that appears multiple times. God could have chosen to bring 7 plagues against them. And of course, 7 is a number of God and a number of perfection, but that's not what he chose. He could have chose to use 12, which is generally a number of his people. We've got 12 tribes of the Old Testament, 12 apostles of the New Testament. He could have used number 12, and my people are greater than your people. He used 10. As I was looking through the scriptures to find occurrences of the number 10, we actually could put together a top 10 list of the use of the number 10. It's used a lot. Just some of the ones that we're familiar with. The 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments. The tithe of the Old Testament, that's 10%. The temple had 10 lavers and 10 lampstands and 10 tables in it. We go to the New Testament, look at the parables of Jesus. There's a parable that has the 10 coins. Another parable has 10 minas. There's another parable with the 10 virgins. Go on over and into the book of Revelation, you're going to read about the 10 days of persecution against the church that was at Smyrna. You're going to read about the beast that has 10 horns and 10 crowns. The number 10 appears over and over again. The significance of the number 10, it's an image of completeness. Over and over, that is what it demonstrates, is completeness. The 10 Commandments is a summary of the 613 commandments that were given in the Old Law. And so each and every one of those 613, you can fit into one of those 10 commandments. It's a summary of the law. The 10 virgins were used to represent all of God's people. We've got the wise and the foolish. Not all of God's people are wise. But that's the complete picture of all of God's people. Some will go to heaven, some will not. And so I believe that the use of the 10 here is simply God is going to demonstrate his complete power over all these false gods, over Egypt and over his people, and through the process, of course, keep the promise that he has made. It will reveal his dominion, his power through the 10. And so we're not going to get bogged down too much in all the details of the plagues, but I said to you that these deal with the gods and goddesses of Egypt. And so let's notice that as we go through considering them. The first plague that is brought upon them, water from the Nile is turned into blood. And there's a number of Egyptian gods that this would have affected. There's the Num, who is the guardian of the river source. There's Osiris, who is the blood. The Nile is considered to be his bloodstream. But Hapi is likely the god that is most affected by this. He's the god of the Nile itself. And rather than it being the wonderful pure water that it ought to be, no, it's blood. God turns it to blood. Now, in chapter 7 and verse 22, we're told that Pharaoh called his magicians. And he wanted to know, can they do this? And so they were able to repeat the same thing by their enchantments. And so the end result is Pharaoh's heart grows hard. Why would I let the people of Israel go? Look, my own magicians can do this as well. The second plague, introduced to us in the first bit of chapter 8, there are frogs covering the land. They've come up out of the Nile River, and they're in people's beds, they're in their ovens, they're in their bowls, they're everywhere, frogs everywhere. Again, I think this would be a fight against Hapi, who is the god of the Nile, where the frogs came from, but Heket is the goddess of fertility. And if you see the pictures of Heket, has the head of a frog. And so this is against this goddess. You know, it's ironic that their fertility goddess has the head of a frog, and the frogs are being very fertile in the land, and it was not a good thing. This was a plague to the people. In chapter 8 and at verse 7, Pharaoh calls his magicians in. I want you to do, I don't know why you would want to, but he wants them to repeat it. I want you to do the same thing. And so they also are able, through their enchantments, to produce more frogs. The third plague, lice coming from the dust of the earth. Aaron struck the dust of the earth with his rod, and lice spread throughout all the land of Egypt. The god of the earth in ancient Egypt was Geb. It would be his duty to bless the earth and to bless the people from the earth. And yet the earth, the dust of the earth, was the source of the lice that was experienced by everyone. As he did with the blood, water turning to blood, as he did with the frogs, Pharaoh calls upon his magicians. Again, I don't know why you would want more lice in the land, but he wants them to duplicate what Moses and Aaron have done, and this time they're not able to repeat it. They don't know how to do this. They have no enchantment that can cause lice to come like this has happened. And in fact, when they could not do it, their explanation to Pharaoh is, this is the finger of God. Notice, they did not say, their God is somewhat powerful. This is the finger of, not a God, of God. They have acknowledged there's power here that we have no access to. This is something greater than what Egypt has ever seen. Plague number 4, we've got swarms of flies coming around. They're in the houses, they're covering the ground. You walk along the ground and there's actually flies all over the ground. Everywhere there are flies. Again, Geb, the god of the earth, was minimized in this plague, but primarily this was likely against their god of creation, which was Herpri. He's pictured with the head of a fly. At this point, the Lord makes a distinction. You see, the water turning to blood, the frogs coming up from the Nile, the lice from the dust of the earth, that was upon all of Egypt, including the land of Goshen. God's people experienced those bad things, and I suspect that it's a lesson for his people who are not believing in Moses, not believing the message, not believing that they're going to go up out of the land of Egypt. Let me get your attention. And so the first 3 plagues are actually against his own people as well. Starting at this 4th plague, Goshen will not be touched. God has their attention. And now he will make a distinction between the Egyptian and the Hebrew so that his people now can build up their faith. They understand God is powerful now. By the 3rd plague, they got it. God's powerful. But now it's time for them to see God is going to deliver. And so they're not subject to any of the plagues from this point onward. Plague number 5. Severe pestilence would come among the livestock in Egypt. Again, Goshen is exempt. There's a lot of livestock in Goshen, you know that, because they're shepherds. But they're exempt. There are a host of gods that this would strike against. They have all kinds of gods that have ram's heads and bull's heads and cow's heads and so forth. And so Hathor, who is the goddess of love, would be one of those, Apis and Amun, and there's several of them who would be affected by this one. Again, God is using the very things that the Egyptians worship to bring plagues on them. He's striking out against their gods. Plague number 6. Ashes from a furnace were taken, and they were scattered up to the heavens. And the end result was that the fine dust which fell back to the earth would cause boils and sores to break out on the Egyptians and on their animals, any that didn't die in the pestilence. Again, more than one Egyptian deity is under fire with this plague. Isis, the goddess of healing and protection and peace. Serapis and Imhotep, who are gods of healing. The boils got so bad that the magicians of Pharaoh could not even come out and stand against Moses. Chapter 9, verse 11. It sounds like, just based on that reference in chapter 9 and verse 11, Pharaoh continued to bring his magicians in and continued to ask them, do what they're doing. Why can't you do what they're doing? At this point, they can't even come out. They're so sore because of the boils, they can't stand. Of course, they can't duplicate what's being done. Plague number 7. There is a heavy hail falling all over the land of Egypt. Again, Goshen is exempt. This doesn't fall upon God's people. This hail was so heavy that if you were outside in it, it would kill you. If your animals were outside in it, it would kill them. Again, the weakness of all the livestock-related gods is displayed in this. But also the goddess of the sky, Nut, because the very thing that she's supposed to protect the people from and use to serve them, the sky, is bringing destruction on them and their possessions. Listen to what the Lord said to Pharaoh before the plague happened. This is chapter 9, verse 15 beginning. If I had stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence. Remember, we had that upon the livestock just a couple plagues ago. If I had struck you and your people with pestilence, then you would have been cut off from the earth. You know what that is? That's God saying, I'm being merciful. Things could be worse. You'd be dead now if I wanted you to be dead now. But indeed, for this purpose, I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. As yet, you exalt yourself against my people, in that you will not let them go. Do you know what the easy solution to this whole deal would be? Let the people go. As soon as Pharaoh will send the people of Israel away from Egypt, the plagues will cease. It could have ended back here after the first one. Water turned to blood in the land. Oh, we don't want this. Let the people go. He's not interested. Even here after or leading up to the seventh plague, he still has a hard heart, is not willing to let the people go. And God tells him, I've raised you up for this purpose. I'm giving you the command that you don't want to obey for this purpose, so I can show my power in you. Notice, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Go forward from this time approximately 40 years, and the people are ready to come into the land of Canaan. They should have went in 40 years previous, but they were rebellious against God. But when Joshua leads them into the land of Canaan and they cross over the Jordan River, do you remember what's going on inside the city of Jericho? They have shut up the gates. They have tightened the city up. No one goes out, no one comes in, because they're terrified of the God of the Hebrews. 40 years later, they know what happened in Egypt, and they want no part of that. I have raised you up so that I can show my power in you, and my name may be declared in all the earth. In verse 20, here's a distinction now even in the Egyptians. There are some Egyptians who, they're sort of getting the point. They're seeing the power of God in all these things that are taking place. And those Egyptians who feared the word of the Lord made sure that they were inside when the hail came, and that their animals were inside when the hail came. They understand God's serious. He's actually going to do what he said he's going to do. Plague number 8. A large swarm of locusts would ravage the land of Egypt. Anything that wasn't destroyed by the hail would now be consumed by the locusts. The land is left bare. This is squarely upon the goddess Serapia. She is the goddess of safety and protection, including protection from the locusts. Pharaoh's servants, leading up to this plague, here's what Pharaoh's servants say. Chapter 10 and verse 7, they're speaking to Pharaoh. How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed? Why do you keep resisting? Why won't you just let them go? Are you blind? Don't you see what's happening to your land? And so what Pharaoh did, he actually called Moses and Aaron to come in. And he offered them a compromise. Who's going to go? That was his question. Who's going to go? And of course, Moses said, well, everybody. We're all going to go. No. Just the men can go. There's no compromise. That's not what God was calling for. Let my people go, not let the men of my people go. And so Moses refused, and then the plague of the locust came upon Egypt. Plague number 9. Thick darkness would fall over the land for 3 days. This would be against Ra, the greatest of all the Egyptian gods, save Pharaoh himself. He is the sun god. Not only is it against Ra, but it's also against Thoth, who is the moon god. Understand, there is no light. Even the moon is not shining. Absolute darkness for 3 days, day and night. Think of the psychological impact that would have on the Egyptians. Day and night for 3 days. Nothing but darkness. 72 hours of darkness. The God of the Hebrews is powerful enough that he can keep Ra from shining upon us. That's the message to them. And so the thick darkness covers all of Egypt. But remember, in nearby Goshen, it's daylight, and then at night it gets dark, and the moon is shining, and then it's daylight, and then it gets dark, and the moon is shining. You know, it's a completely different experience for God's people. Plague number 10. The death of the firstborn throughout all Egypt. I said that starting at plague number 4, God made a distinction. And he did. These first 3 were upon everybody, even in the land of Goshen. From number 4 down to number 9, Goshen is free. None of these are upon them. It's just upon the Egyptian people. Plague number 10 could touch the Hebrews. If they did not do what God commanded them to do, then their firstborn would also die. This is where the Passover comes in. Now, so far as this plague, it is squarely upon Pharaoh. Remember, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. His title means great house. He is the great house of Egypt. Egypt is established on him. All of Egypt belongs to him. This is against him because the next Pharaoh is going to die as a child. Chapter 11, verse 4. It says, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like before, nor shall it be like it again. All the firstborn in Egypt will die. Moses prepares the people of Israel. The Lord is coming through the land. Take a lamb for yourselves and kill it and prepare it and eat it. Make sure it's completely eaten. Take the blood of that lamb, and I want you to put that on your doorpost and on the lintel. Because God will look for the blood. And if he sees the blood, he will pass over your house. And no one will die in the house. You can understand that there's some implications in this for you and I. Because the significance of blood and what Christ is going to do. We're going to address that, Lord willing, next week. But for now, we're just looking at this as the plague upon Egypt. And so, at midnight, the Lord comes through Egypt. And when he sees blood on the doorpost and the lintel, he passes by. But you know that's not happening in Egypt itself. That's only happening in Goshen. And so all the firstborn of the Egyptians, including Pharaoh's son, who would be the next leader, have died. It's interesting going through these chapters, chapter 7 through 12, to follow what's going on among the people. Remember at the close of our study last week, the people of Israel were despised and mistreated. They were working harder than they'd ever worked before, and they'd already been working really hard. The Israelites hated Moses because they blamed Moses for the oppression. Pharaoh was indignant at the idea that this slave population should set aside their labors that make Egypt great. He's building Egypt on the back of the slaves, and go worship a slave god. Through this text today, there have been some huge changes. Chapter 8, verse 19, the magicians of Egypt have acknowledged God is greater than we are and than our gods are. This is the finger of God. Pharaoh, don't you see what's happening? The Egyptian people have begun to fear the Lord. Remember was it plague number 6? They brought their livestock in, and they stayed in themselves. They didn't want destruction upon themselves. The Egyptian people have begun to question Pharaoh and his decision to not let the people go. Albeit too late, Egypt was already in shambles. Moses has gone from being hated by the Israelites and being timid about the idea of appearing before Pharaoh to being mighty in the land. Remember what God said in chapter 7 and verse 1, I have made you as God to Pharaoh. Just imagine the first time he goes in before Pharaoh to say, well, God says, let people go. I don't think that he was mighty in voice when he went to do that. He had just said to the Lord that I'm of uncircumcised lips. How shall Pharaoh heed me? Things haven't been going very well. But as the plagues continue, you can just imagine how much more confident Moses is. I will make you like God to Pharaoh. And so he walks in and out of Pharaoh's court, unchallenged and unharmed. Notice chapter 11, verse 3. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. That's the Hebrews, the slaves. The Lord gave the Hebrew slaves favor in the sight of the Egyptians. End of chapter 6. You need to do more work. You need to go find your own straw. We're not going to give you straw. Now they're finding favor among the people. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Pharaoh's servants see Moses coming. You know what they do? First step away. He's a dangerous guy. All this stuff that's going on, Moses is at the center of it. But then not only among Pharaoh's servants, remember, who are Pharaoh's servants? Everybody in Egypt. He owns all of Egypt. And so who then are the people at the latter part of chapter 11, verse 3? That's the Hebrews. At the beginning of this text, they hated him. Moses, we are suffering because of you. In fact, towards the end of chapter 6, when their leaders went into Pharaoh and pleaded with him, why are you bringing all this extra oppression? And Pharaoh said, because you're lazy, and so you're going to have to go get your own straw. They came out, and as they came out, they saw Moses. And they blamed him. Moses, this is your fault that we're going through this. Now, he was very great in the sight of the people. Remember, plagues 1, 2, 3, the Israelites received those as well, a wake-up call. Folks, we serve a God who is powerful. They realized that was the case. Plagues 4 through 9, it's just on Egypt, so now they understand we serve a God who plans on releasing us. And that's why the people have favor in the sight of the Egyptians now. Plague number 10, this is going to be the release. Pharaoh will actually send them away. Folks are changing through this text. Everybody except one person, Pharaoh. Pharaoh does not change. Take a look at Pharaoh through this entire text, and what we find is a man who continues to be stubborn and in denial. Let me give you a quick summary of the things that we read about Pharaoh. Chapter 7 and verse 13. After seeing Aaron's rod swallow the magician's rods, Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Chapter 7, verse 22. After seeing his magicians turn water into blood, Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Chapter 8 and verse 15. After asking Moses to entreat the Lord for him because of the frogs and saying, "I'll let the people go," he changed his mind once the frogs were gone and hardened his heart. Chapter 8, verse 19. After hearing from his magicians that the lice, which they could not mimic, was from the finger of God, Pharaoh's heart grew hard. Chapter 8, verse 32, Pharaoh asked Moses to entreat the Lord, "Take away the flies that are among us," promising he would let the people go and sacrifice to God afterward. When the flies were gone, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Chapter 9 and at verse 7, Pharaoh sent servants to Goshen. He wanted to see the pestilence. Moses said the pestilence was only among our livestock. He sent messengers to go and see. And when he found that it was so, the heart of Pharaoh became hard. Chapter 9 and verse 12, his magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. Chapter 9, verse 27, after the hail killed man and beast who were out in it, Pharaoh acknowledged that he had sinned. "I have sinned this time," he says. He asked Moses to entreat the Lord and promised to let the people go. After the hail ceased, he sinned yet more, and he hardened his heart. After his own people called into question his stubbornness, Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron. He wants them in his presence. He tries to strike a compromise. They're not willing to compromise. He drives them out from his presence. Chapter 10 and verse 16, after the locust came upon the land, Pharaoh acknowledged again, "I've sinned." He asked for forgiveness. "Entreat the Lord for me." No sooner were the locusts gone, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart again. I don't want to let people go. Chapter 10 and verse 20. Excuse me, that is chapter 10, verse 20. Chapter 10, verse 27. While darkness was on the land, Pharaoh tried to strike another deal with Moses and Aaron. They wouldn't compromise. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Chapter 12 and verse 31. His son is dead. He battled against God over and over. Remember, he is Pharaoh. He is the great house. He is the greatest of all the Egyptian gods. He lost. His son is dead. He says to Moses when he calls him to his presence. Now, understand, the last thing he said when he drove them out, flight number 9, "You see my face again, I'm going to kill you." That was his threat against Moses. He calls from Moses. He says, "Go, serve the Lord. Take your flocks and be gone." And he asked them to bless him. He had stood up against the God of the Hebrews, a slave god. He lost. Because Pharaoh is not a god. And the myriad of gods that he and his people serve are not gods. There is but one God, that is Yahweh. What are some lessons out of this for you and I today? First thing is, God keeps his promises. God sent Moses to Egypt, and the promise was, "I'm going to bring the people up out of the land of Egypt. I'm going to take them to a land that flows with milk and honey." God keeps his promises. At the beginning of our text, Hebrew life was bleak. At the end of our text, they are walking out of Egypt as free people. God keeps his promises. He's promised you and I heaven if we'll serve him faithfully. God keeps his promises. We need to serve him faithfully. Maybe we need some plagues against us like the first 3 to get our attention, to understand the power of God and understand that he does do what he says he'll do. And then maybe some blessings afterward to get us understanding, yes, we serve a great God. But God will keep his promises. Along the way, there are going to be trials and difficulties, but the glories of heaven far exceed that. God keeps his promises. Second thing, there is only one God. Pharaoh trusted in the gods of his people. In fact, he trusted in himself as a god. His faith in them and in himself took a huge blow with each successive plague. This god fell, this god fell, this god fell, this god fell. All of the gods of Egypt were falling. If we are placing our confidence in anything or anyone but the Lord, then we are setting ourselves up for a fall. Because there is only one God. We need to trust the Lord and his power because he alone is God. God's going to support us as we do his will. We're not told, but I wonder at what point in all this Moses started to get it. At the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7, he still hadn't. He was still saying, well, who am I to go into Pharaoh? Why should he listen to me? Because I sent you, Moses. That's why. But Moses didn't believe that, and yet he went ahead and he did what God commanded him to do. Even though he was in doubt, he went ahead. And then through the plagues, I'm sure that his boldness in the Lord grew. The first time that he walks in, I wonder if he's sort of sheepish and looking around, seeing, who's gonna put a knife through me or something. By the time that he goes through, the third, fourth, fifth plague, whatever one it was, he's likely walking with his head held high, not proud in himself, but boasting in the Lord. Moses hadn't done any of this. The Lord's doing all of this. God is going to support us as we do his will. And maybe our faith is not what it ought to be at the beginning, but you know what the answer is? Do what he said anyways. Maybe we have doubts and we're just not sure. Do what he said anyways. Because the end result is our faith is going to grow, and that's what happened with Moses. What did God say to him? I have made you as God to Pharaoh. Moses, you will be great and reign over Pharaoh. God brought it to pass. God's going to support us as we do his will. No compromise. There were a couple of times when Pharaoh was willing to deal. Well, okay, some of you can go, but not all of you. Or all of you can go, but you can't take your flocks with you. God had not authorized Moses to make any kind of a settlement with Pharaoh. And so the answer had to be everything and everyone is going. In fact, there's a text that words it this way, not a hoof shall be left behind. All of our flocks are going with us. We can't compromise God's will. We don't have the authority from God to compromise what his word says. He said what he said, he meant what he said, and we need to do what he said. No compromise. Oh, well, but no, there is no buts. We have no right to compromise anything that God has revealed. And finally, God makes a distinction between his people and others. He made a distinction here between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, and he still does. It is not that he sought the destruction of the Egyptians. That's not it. God's purpose there was not to destroy Egypt. His purpose was to humble Egypt. Remember, in that list of plagues, if after plague number 1, Pharaoh had said, I give up, the people of Israel go, guess how many more plagues there would have been? None. There'd be no need for them. God told him in the midst of all of it, I've risen you up so that I can show my great power and so that you and all the earth will know that there is but one God. Had he just humbled himself, it would have been done. The same is true today. There is a distinction between the child of God and the people of the world. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 14, it talks about how his angels are ministering spirits for those who will inherit eternal salvation. There's no that says his angels are ministering spirits for other people. And you and I may not see them and see what they do, but the scripture tells us there are ministering spirits out there. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and at verse 12, we're told that God hears our prayers. If we are faithfully serving God, God hears our prayers. But he doesn't hear the prayers of those who are engaged in sin. In 1 Corinthians 10 and at verse 13, it says, God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able, but with the temptation will make the way of escape so that we may be able to bear it. That's a promise made to Christians. Now, the way of escape is available to the non-Christian, but they're not interested in it. They don't want Scripture. 2 Peter 2 and at verse 9 beginning, it says, the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who walk according to the flesh in the lust of uncleanness and despise authority. God makes a distinction. And it's not a matter of God being partial. It's a matter of, will we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord or not? That will determine where we fall before the Lord.